The notification sound chimed on Robert's phone at 2:47 a.m. He shouldn't have been awake, but sleep had become a stranger to him in the 18 months since Margaret passed. The blue glow of the screen illuminated his weathered face as he opened the dating app message. "Hello, handsome American man," it read, accompanied by a photo of a woman with dark eyes and a smile that seemed to pierce through the digital divide. "My name is Maria. I think you are very interesting." At 62, Robert Chen had never expected to feel his heart race again. He certainly never expected it would race for a 28-year-old woman from the Philippines he'd never met. But in that moment, staring at her message in his empty house in suburban Phoenix, something inside him that had been dormant for far too long suddenly stirred to life. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected love and devastating betrayal, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and human nature. Robert had been a cautious man his entire life. 34 years as an aerospace engineer at Lockheed Martin had taught him to analyze, to question, to verify every detail before making a decision. He'd built a comfortable life with Margaret, raised 2 children who now lived across the country with families of their own, and accumulated a modest but secure retirement fund. The house on Elm Street had been their dream home, with its Spanish tile roof and the garden Margaret had lovingly tended for decades. But after the cancer took her, the house felt like a mausoleum, each room echoing with memories that brought more pain than comfort. His children called occasionally, but they had their own lives, their own struggles. The loneliness was suffocating, a weight on his chest that grew heavier with each passing day. That's what led him to the dating sites, initially just as a way to have conversations with another human being. He'd tried local dating apps first, but the women his age seemed to carry the same burden of loss and disappointment that he did. Their conversations felt like exchanges of medical updates and complaints about adult children who never called. Then, almost by accident, he'd stumbled onto an international dating site. The profiles were different here. Younger women from the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, all claiming to want serious relationships with American men. Robert knew it seemed unlikely, improbable even, but he was desperate for something, anything to fill the void that Margaret's absence had left behind. Maria Delgado appeared in his inbox like an answer to prayers he'd been too proud to utter. Her profile said she was 28, a college graduate who worked as a teacher in a small town outside Manila. Her photo showed a petite woman with long black hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and sadness. She wasn't just beautiful, though she certainly was that. She was articulate, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know him. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours, spanning topics from his work in aerospace to her dreams of seeing the Grand Canyon. She told him about growing up poor in the Philippines, how education had been her way out of poverty, and how she'd always dreamed of America as a land of endless possibilities. She asked about Margaret, and when he shared his grief, she responded with such empathy and understanding that he found himself crying for the first time since the funeral. "Love is not about age," she wrote to him one evening. "It is about finding someone who understands your heart." For the first time in months, Robert felt like someone actually saw him, not just as a widower or a retiree, but as a man still capable of love and being loved. She seemed to understand his loneliness in a way that felt almost supernatural, always knowing exactly what to say when the darkness threatened to overwhelm him. She shared stories of her own struggles, her fear of never finding true love, her dreams of building a family with someone who would cherish and protect her. Robert found himself looking forward to their daily conversations more than anything else in his carefully ordered life. The relationship progressed with a speed that should have alarmed him, but felt instead like destiny unfolding. Within 2 weeks, they were video chatting daily, and Maria's face on his laptop screen became the highlight of Robert's existence. She would call him while getting ready for work, her hair still damp from the shower, and he'd watch mesmerized as she applied her makeup and prepared for her day teaching elementary school children. She'd share photos of her students, their gap-toothed smiles and eager faces, and Robert could see the genuine love she had for them. But there were details that didn't quite add up, inconsistencies that his engineer's mind noted but his heart chose to ignore. Sometimes she'd mention having electricity problems, yet her video calls were always crystal clear. She claimed to live in a small apartment, but the backgrounds of her calls showed different rooms, different lighting. When he asked about visiting her in the Philippines, she'd grow quiet and change the subject, saying she was saving money to visit him instead because she wanted to see America first. The red flags were there, subtle but present, like hairline cracks in a foundation that would later prove catastrophic. She began asking gentle questions about his life, his work history, his home, his finances. She seemed particularly interested in his retirement plans and whether he lived alone. When he mentioned his late wife's life insurance policy, Maria grew suddenly very attentive, asking careful questions about his financial security and future plans. Robert attributed her interest to practical concerns about their potential future together, never suspecting that she was methodically cataloging his assets like a predator studying prey. As weeks turned into months, Robert found himself completely emotionally dependent on Maria's daily presence in his life. She had become his confidant, his emotional anchor, the reason he got up each morning. He'd rearranged his entire schedule around their communication, declining invitations from friends and canceling plans with his children when they conflicted with their chat times. She had become his world, and he'd isolated himself from everyone else in service of nurturing their long-distance relationship. The financial request started small and seemed entirely reasonable. Her phone was broken and she needed a new one to continue their video calls. Could he help her with $200? Her apartment roof was leaking and the landlord was threatening eviction unless she paid for repairs. Could he wire her $500 to help? Each request came with elaborate explanations, photos of the supposed problems, and promises to pay him back as soon as she could save enough from her teaching salary. Robert sent the money without hesitation, each transfer accompanied by messages reassuring her that he was happy to help, that partners supported each other through difficulties. The requests grew larger and more frequent. Her mother fell ill and needed expensive medication, $800. Her school was closing and she needed money to travel to Manila for job interviews, $1,000. A family emergency required immediate funds, $1,500. With each transfer, Maria's gratitude was effusive, emotional, accompanied by tearful video calls where she promised to make it up to him and declared her undying love. Robert had never felt so needed, so important to another person's survival and happiness. He was her hero, her savior, her American dream made manifest. The money felt like a small price to pay for the love and devotion she showered on him in return. By the time 6 months had passed, he'd sent her nearly $12,000, liquidating CDs and dipping into his retirement savings. But it felt like an investment in their future together, in the life they were building across continents and time zones. The proposal came during a particularly emotional video call in late November. Maria was crying, telling him about another financial crisis. This time her landlord was not just threatening eviction, but had given her 48 hours to pay 3 months back rent or face being thrown onto the street. She needed $3,000 immediately, more money than Robert had readily available without accessing his retirement funds. As he watched her tears through the pixelated video connection, something inside him crystallized into absolute certainty. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the words surprising even him. "Come to America and marry me. We'll figure out the rest together." Maria's tears stopped instantly, replaced by a smile so radiant it seemed to illuminate his entire computer screen. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, my darling Robert. I will be the best wife to you. I will love you forever." They spent the next 3 hours planning their future together, the wedding ceremony, the home they'd build, the life they'd create. Robert felt more alive than he had since Margaret's death, filled with purpose and excitement about the future. He immediately began researching fiancé visas, immigration lawyers, and the complex process of bringing Maria to America. The paperwork was daunting, but Robert attacked it with the same methodical precision he'd once applied to aerospace engineering. He hired an immigration attorney, gathered financial documents, and submitted Form 1129-F to begin the K-1 visa process. Maria was ecstatic, sending him dozens of messages daily expressing her excitement about their upcoming marriage and her gratitude for his patience with the bureaucratic process. She began sharing photos of wedding dresses she was considering, asking his opinion on flowers and venues. The future felt bright and full of possibility for the first time since Margaret's death. The visa approval came through faster than expected just 4 months after submission. Robert had prepared everything meticulously. He'd renovated the guest bedroom into a bride suite, stocked the refrigerator with Filipino foods he'd researched online, and even enrolled in a basic Tagalog course to surprise Maria with a few phrases in her native language. He bought her a plane ticket from Manila to Phoenix, first class because he wanted her arrival in America to be special, memorable, the beginning of their fairy tale together. The night before her departure, they had their longest video call ever, nearly 6 hours of talking about their dreams, their fears, and their excitement about finally being together. Maria seemed unusually emotional, crying more than usual, which Robert attributed to the magnitude of the life change she was making. "I love you so much, Robert," she kept saying. "You have saved my life. You have given me everything I ever dreamed of." He assured her that he was the lucky one, that she was bringing joy and purpose back into his life after the darkest period he'd ever experienced. They planned every detail of her first week in America, trips to the Grand Canyon, shopping for her wedding dress, meeting his children over video calls, beginning the process of adjusting her status to permanent resident. Robert had never felt more hopeful about the future, more certain that he was making the right decision. Margaret had been the love of his youth, but Maria would be the love of his golden years, the partner who would help him navigate the rest of his life's journey. Maria arrived on a Tuesday evening in March, and Robert will never forget the moment he saw her walking through the arrival gate at Sky Harbor International Airport. She was smaller than he'd expected, more delicate, but her smile when she spotted him was like sunrise after a long, dark night. She ran to him with her single small suitcase, throwing her arms around his neck with such enthusiasm that other travelers stopped to smile at their obvious joy. The first few days were everything Robert had dreamed they would be. Maria was affectionate, grateful, and seemed genuinely amazed by everything American, the size of grocery stores, the efficiency of traffic lights, the abundance of choices in every aspect of daily life. She marveled at his house, calling it a palace, and spent hours exploring every room, touching furniture and fixtures like they were precious artifacts. She cooked traditional Filipino dishes that filled the house with unfamiliar but enticing aromas, and she listened with rapt attention as he shared stories about his life, his work, and his marriage to Margaret. At night, she would curl up beside him on the couch, her head on his shoulder as they watched movies or planned their wedding ceremony. Robert felt complete for the first time since Margaret's death, as if a missing piece of his soul had finally been restored. Maria seemed equally content, constantly expressing her gratitude and love, taking selfies of them together to send to her family back in the Philippines. She was everything he'd hoped for and more, beautiful, loving, appreciative, and apparently as committed to building their life together as he was. The first crack in the perfect facade appeared on Friday morning of her first week. Robert woke to find Maria sitting at his kitchen table, his laptop open in front of her, several of his financial documents spread across the surface. When he asked what she was doing, she smiled apologetically and explained that she was trying to understand American banking systems so she could help him manage their household finances once they were married. It seemed reasonable, even thoughtful, though something about the scene felt slightly off. His important documents were kept in a locked file cabinet in his home office. How had she accessed them? When he asked, she claimed she'd found the cabinet unlocked and had been looking for information about their upcoming marriage license application. Robert wanted to believe her, needed to believe her, so he accepted the explanation and helped her understand the various investment accounts and savings statements. That afternoon, Maria suggested they go shopping for engagement rings, something they hadn't yet done. At Tiffany & Company, she gravitated immediately toward the most expensive pieces, her eyes lighting up as she tried on rings that cost more than most people's cars. When Robert gently suggested they look at more modest options, Maria's face fell in a way that made him feel cruel and stingy. "In the Philippines," she said softly, "we believe that the ring shows how much the man values his woman. I do not need expensive things for myself, but I want people to know how much you love me." Robert found himself purchasing a 3-carat diamond solitaire that cost $18,000, more than he'd planned to spend, but worth it to see Maria's radiant happiness as she held her hand up to the light, watching the diamond sparkle. The weekend brought more concerning behavior, though Robert continued to rationalize each incident as cultural differences or misunderstandings. Maria spent hours on her phone, speaking rapidly in Tagalog to people she claimed were family members sharing news of her engagement. But the conversations sounded intense, urgent, nothing like the joyful sharing of good news that Robert would have expected. When he asked about the calls, Maria became evasive, saying her family was very emotional and wanted to know every detail about her new life. She also began asking detailed questions about his daily routine, what time he left for his part-time consulting job, how long he was typically gone, whether he had neighbors who might stop by unexpectedly. She claimed she wanted to plan surprises for him and needed to know when she'd have privacy to prepare them. Robert was touched by her thoughtfulness, never suspecting that she was actually mapping out his schedule for purposes that had nothing to do with romance. On Sunday, while Robert was showering, his phone rang with a call from his bank's fraud prevention department. Apparently, there had been several attempts to access his online banking account from an unrecognized device, and they wanted to verify that he was aware of the activity. Robert's blood ran cold as he realized the implications, but when he confronted Maria, she burst into tears and explained that she'd been trying to surprise him by learning to manage their joint finances and had accidentally triggered security protocols while trying to log in with information she'd found in his papers. Her tears were so genuine, her explanations so plausible, that Robert found himself apologizing for doubting her and spent the rest of the evening comforting her and reassuring her of his trust. The marriage ceremony was scheduled for the following Friday, exactly 1 week after Maria's arrival at the Maricopa County Courthouse. Robert had wanted something small and simple, just the two of them and a courthouse official, followed by a nice dinner to celebrate. But as the date approached, Maria's behavior became increasingly erratic and demanding. She insisted they needed to invite witnesses, claiming it was important for immigration purposes that they have photographic evidence of a legitimate ceremony. She arranged for a photographer she'd somehow contacted, despite having been in the country for less than a week and not speaking fluent English. She also insisted on purchasing an expensive wedding dress, something she said was essential for the photos that would accompany their immigration paperwork. Every aspect of the wedding planning seemed designed to cost money and create evidence of their relationship's legitimacy, though Maria framed each expense as a romantic necessity or legal requirement. Robert found himself spending thousands more on what was supposed to be a simple courthouse ceremony, but Maria's enthusiasm and apparent expertise about immigration requirements convinced him that the expenses were necessary investments in their future together. The night before the wedding, Maria was unusually quiet and seemed almost melancholy. When Robert asked if she was having second thoughts, she assured him that she was just overwhelmed by how much her life was changing. "Tomorrow," she said, holding his hands in hers, "everything will be different. Our real life together begins tomorrow." Robert interpreted this as bridal nerves and romantic sentiment, never imagining that her words carried an entirely different meaning than the one he understood. The wedding ceremony itself was brief and surprisingly emotional. Maria looked stunning in her white dress, and when she spoke her vows, her voice shook with what Robert interpreted as overwhelming joy and love. She promised to honor him, to cherish him, to be faithful and true for the rest of their lives together. The photographer captured every moment, the exchange of rings, their first kiss as husband and wife, the signing of the marriage certificate. Maria insisted on dozens of photos, different poses and angles, creating what she called a comprehensive record of their special day. After the ceremony, they celebrated with dinner at the most expensive restaurant in Phoenix, where Maria ordered champagne and toasted to their future together. She seemed almost giddy with excitement, taking more photos and posting them to social media accounts that Robert hadn't known she maintained. That night, as they lay in bed as husband and wife for the first time, Maria whispered in his ear that she had never been happier, that he had made all her dreams come true. Robert fell asleep feeling like the luckiest man alive, holding his young, beautiful wife in his arms and dreaming of all the years they would spend together. He had no way of knowing that Maria lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, counting down the hours until she could begin the final phase of a plan she'd been executing with military precision since the moment she'd first messaged him 9 months earlier. The morning after their wedding, Robert woke to an empty bed and the sound of Maria moving around in the kitchen. He found her at the table with his laptop again, but this time she was clearly conducting business of some kind, speaking quietly into her phone in rapid Tagalog while typing furiously. When she saw him, she quickly closed the laptop and ended her call, greeting him with a bright smile and a kiss on the cheek. She explained that she was trying to contact her family to share the good news of their marriage, but the time difference made it difficult to coordinate calls. She'd also been researching the process for adjusting her immigration status, she said, and wanted to begin the paperwork immediately to ensure everything was handled correctly. Robert was impressed by her diligence and attention to detail, interpreting her urgency as eagerness to become a permanent resident and solidify their life together. After breakfast, Maria suggested they go to the bank together so she could be added to his accounts as his legal spouse. This seemed logical and appropriate to Robert. They were married now, and married couples shared financial responsibilities. At the bank, Maria charmed the representative with her enthusiasm about becoming an American citizen and her gratitude for Robert's patience with the complex immigration process. She was added as a joint account holder on his checking and savings accounts, and Robert helped her set up online banking access so she could manage their household expenses while he was at work. The banker commented on what a lovely couple they made and congratulated them on their recent marriage. Driving home, Maria seemed more relaxed than she'd been since arriving in America, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. That afternoon brought the first truly alarming incident, though Robert's mind worked overtime to rationalize what he witnessed. He returned from a brief trip to the grocery store to find Maria in his home office, his filing cabinet open, important documents scattered across his desk. She was photographing papers with her phone, tax returns, investment statements, insurance policies, his passport, social security card, and birth certificate. When he asked what she was doing, Maria's explanation was elaborate and seemingly reasonable. She claimed she was gathering documentation for their immigration attorney, who had supposedly called while Robert was out and requested specific financial and identity documents to complete her status adjustment paperwork. The attorney had been very specific about what was needed, she said, and had emphasized the urgency of providing complete documentation to avoid delays in the process. She was photographing everything so she could email it immediately, as the attorney had requested. Robert felt a chill of unease, as he hadn't given his immigration attorney Maria's contact information and couldn't understand why the lawyer would communicate with her directly rather than through him. But Maria's explanation was detailed and confident, and she seemed hurt by his suspicion. "I am only trying to help us," she said with tears in her eyes. "I do not want any problems with my immigration status that could separate us." Robert apologized for doubting her and helped her organize the documents, even providing additional papers she claimed the attorney had specifically requested. Looking back, he realized this was the moment when Maria gained access to everything she needed to steal his identity and destroy his life. But in the moment, it felt like the natural cooperation of newlyweds working toward their shared future. The final 3 days of their marriage passed in a blur of increasingly bizarre behavior that Robert struggled to interpret as anything other than adjustment difficulties and cultural differences. Maria became obsessed with documenting every aspect of their daily life together, taking hundreds of photos and videos of them in domestic situations, cooking together, watching television, even sleeping. She claimed these would be important evidence for immigration officials who might question the legitimacy of their marriage, and Robert accepted this explanation despite his growing discomfort with the constant documentation. She also began making expensive purchases online, items she claimed were necessary for establishing their household, kitchen appliances, home decor, electronics, jewelry. Each purchase came with a reasonable explanation, and as his legal spouse, she had every right to use their joint accounts for household expenses. But the spending seemed excessive and impulsive, lacking the careful consideration Robert would have expected from someone who had lived in poverty and claimed to understand the value of money. When he gently questioned some of the purchases, Maria became defensive and emotional, accusing him of not trusting her judgment and not wanting her to feel at home in their house. She reminded him that in the Philippines, wives traditionally managed household finances, and she was simply taking on that responsibility as his partner. Robert found himself apologizing and reassuring her that she had complete freedom to make purchases for their home, even as a growing sense of unease settled in his stomach like a stone. On Thursday evening, exactly 1 week after their wedding, Maria announced that she needed to visit a Filipino community center in Phoenix to connect with other immigrants and learn about resources available to new residents. Robert offered to drive her, but she insisted on going alone, saying she needed to practice navigating the city independently and wanted to surprise him with how well she could manage on her own. She borrowed his car, promising to be back in time for dinner, and left him with passionate kisses and declarations of love. Hours passed with no word from her, and when dinner time came and went, Robert began calling her phone. The calls went straight to voicemail, which wasn't entirely unusual given her phone's spotty service, but as the evening stretched into night, his concern turned to panic. By midnight, he was calling hospitals and police stations, convinced something terrible had happened to his young wife in an unfamiliar city. He spent the entire night awake, alternating between worry and anger, imagining car accidents and muggings and kidnappings. When dawn broke with still no word from Maria, Robert's panic reached a fever pitch. He was preparing to file a missing person report when he decided to check their bank accounts online, hoping to see if she'd used their debit card somewhere that might give him a clue to her whereabouts. What he discovered made his blood run cold and his hands shake so violently he could barely operate the computer. The truth hit Robert like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping in his desk chair as the numbers on his computer screen told a story of betrayal so complete and devastating that his mind initially refused to process it. Every account had been drained: checking, savings, money market, even his retirement IRA that should have required additional authentication to access. Transfers had been made throughout the night to accounts he'd never seen before, each one systematically emptying decades of careful saving and financial planning. Over $240,000 was gone, transferred in precise increments designed to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts that might have stopped the theft. But the money was only the beginning of Maria's systematic destruction of his life. His credit cards had been used to make cash advances totaling $30,000, maxing out every available line of credit. New credit card applications had been submitted in his name using information she'd gathered from his personal documents, and several had already been approved and accessed. His identity had been weaponized against him with surgical precision, every detail of his financial life cataloged and exploited while he slept trustingly beside the woman he believed loved him. The immigration documents they'd filed together revealed another layer of betrayal. Maria Delgado wasn't even her real name. According to records he managed to access through their attorney, her actual name was Carmen Santos, and she already had a husband and 2 children in the Philippines. The entire relationship, from their first online conversation to their wedding ceremony 6 days earlier, had been an elaborate fraud designed to separate him from his money and potentially gain fraudulent entry into the United States. When the devastating realization of his situation became clear, have you ever experienced betrayal on this scale? Maybe not exactly like this, but have you or someone you know ever discovered that a person you trusted completely was living a double life? Subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments, because what happened to Robert next shows just how far some people will go to cover their tracks. The discovery of the financial theft was just the beginning of Robert's nightmare. When he tried to report the crime to local police, he encountered the first of many bureaucratic obstacles that would plague his attempts to seek justice. Because Maria was his legal wife and joint account holder, the police explained, her actions weren't technically theft under Arizona law. She had legal access to their marital assets, and the fact that she'd disappeared didn't automatically make her transactions criminal. The immigration fraud was a federal matter, they told him, and he'd need to contact ICE and the FBI to report that aspect of the crime. But even those agencies seemed more interested in his potential liability as someone who'd sponsored a fraudulent immigrant than in helping him recover his stolen money or locate his missing wife. The credit card fraud was clearer criminal activity, but the damage was already done. His credit score had plummeted overnight, and the debt she'd accumulated in his name was his legal responsibility until he could prove fraud, a process that could take months or even years. Robert spent the next few days in a surreal haze of phone calls with banks, credit agencies, law enforcement, and attorneys, each conversation revealing new layers of the trap Maria had constructed around him. The hunt for Maria led Robert down increasingly desperate paths as he realized how thoroughly she'd planned her disappearance. Security footage from the Phoenix airport showed her boarding a flight to Los Angeles just hours after she'd left his house, supposedly to visit the Filipino Community Center. From LAX, she'd boarded another flight to Manila, effectively escaping U.S. jurisdiction before he'd even realized she was gone. The immigration attorney who'd supposedly requested the documents Maria had photographed didn't exist. She'd invented the entire story to gain access to his personal papers. The Filipino Community Center she'd claimed to visit had no record of her inquiry or visit. Even her family emergency stories, the ones that had prompted Robert to send thousands of dollars during their online relationship, were fabrications. The poor mother who needed medical care, the leaking apartment, the school closure, all lies designed to establish a pattern of financial dependence that would make her post-wedding theft seem like an extension of his existing generosity rather than outright fraud. Robert hired a private investigator who specialized in international fraud cases, paying another $10,000 he couldn't afford to lose for a professional assessment of his chances of recovery. The news was devastating. Maria, or Carmen, or whatever her real name might be, had vanished into the vast archipelago of the Philippines with his money, his identity, and his dignity. The private investigator estimated his chances of ever seeing his money again at less than 5%, and his chances of seeing Maria prosecuted for her crimes at virtually zero. The aftermath of Maria's betrayal transformed Robert from a confident, financially secure retiree into a broken man struggling with poverty, depression, and the complete collapse of his faith in human nature. The house on Elm Street, his refuge and sanctuary for over 2 decades, became a prison of memories and regret. Every room held reminders of the week Maria had lived there, the Filipino spices still in his pantry, the expensive wedding dress hanging in the closet, the dozens of photographs on his phone documenting their brief fraudulent marriage. He couldn't afford to stay in the house without his retirement savings, but he couldn't bear to leave the last place that held memories of his life with Margaret. The insurance companies and credit agencies treated him like a co-conspirator rather than a victim, questioning his judgment and implying that his desperation for companionship had made him complicit in his own destruction. His children, when they learned what had happened, oscillated between sympathy and anger, unable to understand how their careful, intelligent father could have been so thoroughly deceived. His son flew in from Seattle to help him navigate the financial and legal aftermath, but their conversations were strained and painful, filled with unspoken recriminations and mutual incomprehension. Robert felt like he'd not only lost his money and his future security, but also his family's respect and his own sense of identity as a competent, rational adult. The legal battle to recover any portion of his losses stretched on for months, consuming what little money Robert had left and providing virtually no results. The federal authorities eventually confirmed that Carmen Santos was part of an organized crime syndicate that operated romance scams targeting lonely American men. Robert learned that he was one of at least a dozen victims she'd cultivated simultaneously, each man believing he was her one true love while she systematically harvested their personal information and financial resources. The operation was sophisticated and international, with connections to money laundering networks that moved stolen funds through multiple countries and currencies before they reached their final destinations. Carmen herself was wanted by Interpol in connection with similar scams targeting men in Australia, Canada, and the UK, but she remained untouchable in the Philippines, which didn't have extradition treaties covering this type of financial crime. Robert's case became part of a larger federal investigation, but individual victims like him were told not to expect any form of compensation or recovery. The government's priority was shutting down the criminal organization, not helping its victims rebuild their destroyed lives. Robert's immigration attorney, the real one he'd hired to handle Maria's status adjustment, informed him that the fraudulent marriage would need to be annulled, adding legal fees and additional bureaucratic complications to his already overwhelming burden of problems. The process of rebuilding began slowly and painfully, with Robert forced to confront not only his financial ruin but also the psychological trauma of having been so completely deceived by someone he'd loved with complete sincerity. He moved out of the house on Elm Street, selling it at a loss to pay off the debts Maria had accumulated in his name and to afford a small apartment across town. The downsizing was brutal. Decades of accumulated possessions, memories of his life with Margaret, the physical manifestations of a successful career and comfortable retirement, all sacrificed to pay for his brief, catastrophic marriage to a woman who'd never existed. He returned to work full-time, taking a consulting position that paid far less than his previous salary, but provided necessary income and structure to his days. Therapy helped him process the shame and self-blame that threatened to consume him, though progress was slow and setbacks were frequent. The therapist helped him understand that sophisticated fraud operations like the one that had targeted him were designed to exploit fundamental human needs for love and connection, and that his desire for companionship after Margaret's death was natural and healthy, even if it had been weaponized against him. Support groups for fraud victims provided some comfort, connecting him with others who'd experienced similar betrayals and understood the unique combination of financial, emotional, and psychological damage that romance scams inflicted on their targets. The hardest part of recovery was learning to trust again, not just other people, but his own judgment and instincts. Robert found himself analyzing every interaction, every conversation, every new person he met for signs of deception or ulterior motives. The spontaneous warmth and openness that had characterized his personality before Margaret's death and Maria's betrayal was replaced by a careful, guarded approach to all relationships. He joined a grief support group for widowers, hoping to find a healthier way to process his loneliness and his need for human connection. The group helped him understand that his vulnerability after Margaret's death had been normal and predictable, and that criminal organizations specifically targeted people in his situation because grief made them more susceptible to manipulation. Slowly, carefully, he began to rebuild social connections with people who knew his story and accepted his wariness as a reasonable response to trauma. His relationship with his children improved as they saw him working to recover and taking responsibility for his healing rather than wallowing in self-pity and regret. His son helped him set up new financial accounts with enhanced security measures and taught him to recognize the warning signs of various types of fraud. His daughter visited more frequently, bringing her children to stay with him and helping him create new, positive memories in his small apartment. A year after Maria's disappearance, Robert received an unexpected call from the FBI agent who'd been handling his case. Carmen Santos had been arrested in Manila in connection with a different romance scam targeting a wealthy Australian businessman. During her arrest, investigators had discovered evidence linking her to dozens of additional victims across multiple countries, including detailed files on each target containing their personal information, financial records, and psychological profiles. Robert's file was among the most extensive, filled with notes about his vulnerabilities, his triggers, and the specific approaches that had proven most effective in manipulating him. The agent asked if Robert would be willing to provide testimony that could be used in building a case against the criminal organization, even though extradition remained unlikely and financial recovery was still virtually impossible. Robert agreed immediately, driven by a desire to prevent other lonely, vulnerable people from experiencing the devastation he'd endured. The process of reviewing the evidence was both validating and traumatic. Seeing the calculated, predatory nature of Carmen's approach confirmed that his victimization had been the result of sophisticated criminal manipulation rather than his own poor judgment. but it also forced him to relive every moment of the relationship and recognize how thoroughly he'd been deceived. The investigation revealed that Maria's entire online presence had been manufactured. The photos, the stories about her life, even the video calls had been carefully orchestrated using multiple accomplices and staged locations designed to create a convincing fictional identity. 2 years after the fraud, Robert had achieved a fragile but genuine stability that he never could have imagined during the darkest days following Maria's betrayal. His financial situation remained precarious. He would never fully recover the money she'd stolen, and he would likely need to work longer than he'd originally planned before retiring again. But he'd learned to find satisfaction and even joy in his smaller, simpler life. The apartment wasn't the dream home he'd shared with Margaret, but it was comfortable and secure, and he'd decorated it with photos of his real family and mementos of his actual life rather than fantasies of fraudulent romance. His consulting work had evolved into a small business helping other seniors navigate technology and online safety, turning his painful experience into a way of protecting others from similar predators. He'd become a volunteer speaker for the FBI's fraud prevention program, sharing his story at senior centers and community organizations to help people recognize and avoid romance scams. The work was emotionally difficult but deeply meaningful, and he'd received dozens of letters from people who'd avoided becoming victims because his presentation had taught them to recognize the warning signs of online predators. His relationships with his children had been strengthened by shared crisis and recovery, and he developed new friendships with other survivors who understood his journey. Most importantly, Robert had learned to honor both his marriage to Margaret and his brief, devastating relationship with Maria as equally real parts of his life story, each teaching him essential lessons about love, loss, trust, and resilience. Margaret had shown him what genuine love looked like: patient, steady, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than manufactured intensity and financial dependence. Maria had taught him that his capacity for love hadn't died with Margaret, but also that desperation and loneliness made him vulnerable to those who would exploit his fundamental decency and generosity. He'd learned to separate his need for companionship from his need for validation, understanding that healthy relationships develop slowly and organically rather than through breathless declarations of instant devotion and elaborate displays of manufactured romance. The experience had aged him, certainly, and left him warier and more cautious than he'd ever been before. But it had also revealed reserves of strength and resilience he hadn't known he possessed, and had connected him to a community of survivors who supported each other through the long process of healing and moving forward. If you've stayed with Robert's story to the end, you understand that the scars from betrayal this deep never fully disappear, but they can become sources of wisdom and strength rather than just pain. Robert's journey from successful engineer to vulnerable widower to fraud victim to survivor and advocate shows us that our worst experiences can become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions to the world. His story reminds us that loneliness makes us all vulnerable, that criminals are sophisticated in their understanding of human psychology, and that recovering from betrayal requires not just financial and legal remedies, but emotional and psychological healing that can take years to achieve. Most importantly, it shows us that even when we've been deceived by someone we trusted completely, our capacity for genuine love and human connection doesn't have to be permanently damaged. Robert never remarried, but he did learn to love again. His children, his grandchildren, his community of fellow survivors, and eventually, carefully and cautiously, himself. His story is a reminder that resilience isn't about avoiding pain or betrayal, but about finding ways to transform our worst experiences into wisdom that can help others avoid similar suffering. If this story has moved you or taught you something about the dangers of online romance scams, please subscribe to our channel, leave a comment about your own experiences with trust and betrayal, and follow us for more real-life stories that explore the full spectrum of human experience, from devastating loss to hard-won redemption. Remember that if you or someone you know is struggling with loneliness or considering online relationships, the warning signs of romance scams are always the same: requests for money, reluctance to meet in person, limited or suspicious online presence, and declarations of love that seem too intense too quickly. Trust your instincts, verify information independently, And remember that genuine love develops over time through shared experiences rather than through elaborate stories and financial emergencies that conveniently require your immediate assistance.